All right, we are live. Welcome everyone to yet another Saving Elephants live stream with yet another panel joining me. We are hoping to be joined by Michael Lukasik here in a moment. He's running a bit behind, but I do have with me here JB Shreve, Avi Wolf, no stranger to the Saving Elephants community. JB, you're not that far from where I am right now, Western Arkansas.
Right.
We're in the same time zone. You are the blogger, the podcaster of endofhistory.net, I think. It's not .com because I always have trouble finding it as .net.
Yeah, that'll take you somewhere else.
It'll take you somewhere else, exactly. A podcast and a blog about current events, history, socio-political issues from a biblical Christian perspective.
Right.
And again, been a guest on the show a number of times. I always love picking your brain, and I've been on your program in the past. Very much not in my neck of woods is our special guest, Avi Wolf, who's on the other side of the pond in Israel itself. Avi has been on Saving Elephants even more frequently for so many different topics. I hate to mention them now because I'd probably forget one, but he is certainly a student of conservative history, and we have enjoyed picking his brain as well. We're going to have a topic, or we're going to discuss, rather, foreign policy. Before we get down to brass tacks, though, I just want to give Avi an opportunity, since he is there in Israel, to give us a sense of what is the mood like, maybe for you personally, those that you're familiar with. What is it like being there in quite literally a war zone?
Well, let me give my own personal experience without getting it too much into detail. I was supposed to start my job as a breaking news editor after the Jewish holidays on October 8th, and I was worried that I wouldn't have anything to write about, strangely enough, because the fight over judicial reform had kind of died down. There were only some boring crime stories. And pretty quickly, I found myself being a breaking news editor, writing about war stories, and a lot of them, and a lot in very grisly detail, the sort I'd only read in history books before, where almost every single day it felt like the number of dead went up by 100 or so. And the atmosphere here has definitely been one where I think everybody agrees that things have changed almost irrevocably, but there's very little agreement on what needs to change, who needs to go home, who needs to be put in charge. Everybody agrees that it's an emergency, but when you're in an emergency mindset, you say, this has to get done, right? But the problem is that some people say this has to get done, and some people say the exact opposite has to get done. So to give just one example of what happened today, when it was revealed that those 6 hostages were murdered by Hamas just before the IDF could come near them, it led to very extreme opposite reactions. On the one hand, you have a very big group that says, we need a hostage yield now, no matter what happens, whatever conditions. And we have the other group that says, we need to hold fast, because if we agree to their terms, then this is just going to happen again and again, and that's just unacceptable. So you have a population that's been subject to a 2-front war at least for almost a year now. We're coming up on October we're coming up on October 8th in less than 2 months. Trying to manage as best they can, trying to hope their loved ones make it back from the front, the hostages' families hoping that their loved ones make it back alive at all. That's just very torn, and everything's kind of held up. So, for instance, people want a commission of inquiry into how on earth this could have happened at all. How did everybody fall asleep at the switch? On the other hand, you don't really have the time, because everybody's at war. And as Abraham Lincoln once said, you must do what we can with the tools we have. Constant turnover is not really going to help effectiveness of leadership. So you have just an enormous amount of tensions, but also an enormous amount of resilience, in my opinion.
So I want to ask as a follow-up to that, Avi, because here in the States anyways, kind of the chatter we hear is that the potential for an attack from Iran could happen at any moment. Like, is that something that is of grave concern, or is that overblown?
My general impression, at least from following the many news sites that I follow, is that there was fear of an Iranian attack a couple of days after Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated. But after about a week or so, it basically became background noise. And people are much more interested in what Hezbollah might do and things like that. And that especially since Iranian leaders themselves have kind of been walking back what they were saying. First, they're saying we're going to hit them, and then we're going, we'll do it at a time and place that's convenient to us. And then even Iran's leader Ali Khamenei talked about how it's not always, you don't always counterattack. Sometimes you have to do it like this or like this. So you walk it back so much, you eventually say, you know what? Maybe they're not really serious at all for whatever reason, or maybe they'll attack, but it's not as scary as it once was. It's part of it is because we're already on a war footing, right? It's not like if Hania had been assassinated while there was relative quiet, then everybody would be panicked. But having already gone through a war, now that we're already going through war, now that we've already suffered an enormous number of dead and wounded, threatening more war is scary, but it's not the kind of surprise, right? It's just, okay, things will get a little worse, but things are already pretty bad, if you will.
Yeah. Well, it certainly makes sense, and I want to, and we may return to those threads here in a moment, but in order to bring JB into the conversation as well, and I mentioned to both of you gentlemen, kind of in introducing you or inviting you to this panel in the first place, my very broad foreign policy angst, if you will, about the elections here in the United States, and I very much do want to know if you either agree or disagree, and at what points you would agree or disagree. I'm going to be very broad here, though, so maybe there's not as much to quibble with. My concern is for those of us who would hold what I, again, broadly would call it a sensible foreign policy, maybe needlessly antagonistic. So I'm going to call it a policy that simultaneously recognizes the fallenness of humanity and the fact that we can't live it's not, there is going to be war and conflict, and there ought to be some sort of a robust, strong foreign policy, while at the same time, one that couples that with what I guess I will call a prudential caution. But that doesn't just mean we get to spread democracy everywhere we like, that we have limited resources, and we ought to be very cautious how we use our power. That is not something I see either major political party, particularly either major political party's candidates for president, offering the United States. And this is something that it is not as if both political parties have ever, one has ever offered the perfect foreign policy, but it does seem like we're in a particularly precarious place where the world is on fire in a lot of ways, and the what the United States does can have enormous consequences across the globe that it will eventually impact us even back here at home. So to be specific, what I mean by that is I think Kamala Harris is probably going to be a continuation of the Biden administration. I'm sure there's going to be some differences. Part of that is because I don't think she's particularly strong on foreign policy, so she's probably going to rely on a lot of her advisors who are going to come from the Biden, possibly Obama era. And this is one that I have very mixed feelings about, because on rhetoric, I think they get a lot of things right. They seem to stand with Israel. They seem to recognize that Putin invading Ukraine is not a good thing and ought to be stood against. They seem to recognize that we need allies like NATO. But then they seem to do this kind of peculiar, but Ukraine, don't invade Russia, or we're not going to give you long-term missiles, or maybe we will, maybe we won't. And maybe it's a little bit different scenario with Israel and Hamas, because without our aid, I don't see Ukraine. Without Western aid, I don't see Ukraine winning the war. But even still, there's this sort of like half step. Yes, we're for you, but we're not completely there. This might fall in line with, and actually, it looks like Mr. Lukasik is able to join us. Let me add him to the stage. Michael, there you are.
Hey, all. So sorry for being late.
That's quite all right. I was actually about to evoke your name here. So this is Michael joining us in the conversation. He is a CEO of Pipe Creek Consulting. That is a political consulting firm. It does not have anything to do with pipes, from what I understand. Based in Washington, D.C. You are I think I would correctly label you a Kirkian conservative who nonetheless doesn't have nearly as romantic an idea about foreign policy, maybe even a more Charles Krauthammer realism, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay. And what I was about to say was, I see the Biden, or rather Kamala Harris, as a potential continuation of Biden, potential continuation of Obama, maybe even Bill Clinton, of kind of a liberal internationalism, belief in the international system. Thank God for that. Let's keep our allies, but also sort of a maybe not robust understanding of human nature and the need to confront evil in all its forms. I'll get off that for just a moment, because I want to turn to Trump. I honestly am not entirely certain what Trump 2.0 brings us. Partially because I think he's even less experienced with foreign policy than Kamala Harris. I think he even has less of a robust view there. I think he very often is maligned by the left of being someone who cozies up with Russia. And certainly he takes some positions on Russia I don't like. But I don't think he's nearly as nefarious as some suggest. That being said, I think he is highly susceptible to the people he puts in power to advise him. And my deep concern with Trump is that Trump 2.0, the second administration, is going to be staffed with people like J.D. Vance, who have a far more friendly view towards Russia than it would with the individuals certainly like a John Bolton in the first Trump administration. Again, I say all this to say those are my views. And so therefore I'm saying, look, as a conservative, as somebody who has a foreign policy that isn't in alignment with these, I don't see any particularly good options. But I do want to open this up to the floor, JB or Michael or Avi, if you want. Are you... does that sound like a fair representation of what's on offer? Or do you think that I've got that wrong?
I agree with most of that, Josh. The one thing that I would throw in there on that unknown with Trump is just his ability to be provocative, needlessly provocative at times. And it just seems right now with the state of the world, the international community, there's so much that could happen. It feels like we're on the precipice of so many things that could break out and go to the next level or the next 3 levels, that provocations are unnecessary. They're always unnecessary, I guess, but just more unhelpful now than they've ever been. And it seems like that's the thing that Trump kind of lives on, kind of thrives on. And even though his advisors may steer the normal course of the day, it's what happens in those press conferences, what happens on Twitter, what happens when he's making a visit to NATO. What's he going to say there that could change, literally cost lives, put lives in the balance when he says something needlessly provocative, and then Russia pushes in another 50 miles from the east, and that just changes the whole situation on the ground. So that's the one thing that makes me. You asked the question in your email: is there anything that in either of the candidates that we would line up with, or that are close to lining up with? And I can't say that I would line up with either of them. There's never a perfect scenario, but the thing that drives me further from Trump is that right there. The Kamala Harris, I agree with your assessment there, but I do think at least we can get more of the expected and less of the unexpected on that route. That's my perspective.
Michael, do you want to join in?
Well, I was just going to say, I think everything you just said, JB, is very accurate. But I also think that it's something that goes a little bit deeper than personality. I think there's an ideological component to what's going on here. And I think that an underexplored aspect of the similarities between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is that in a lot of ways, they're both declinists. They don't think that America can be the power that creates world order, right? For different reasons, right? I think Trump has this sort of Jacksonian, semi-Nixonian view of cultural decay and America's best days are behind us. I think that's a lot of the spirit behind the "Make America Great Again" slogan. And with Kamala Harris, I think it has a lot to do with that liberal internationalism you were mentioning earlier, Josh, and this idea that America shouldn't be the global power ordering things. And so in terms of, from a sort of Charles Krauthammer Democratic realist perspective, right, I think that we should want the United States to be the global power. I think there's something good about a certain kind of hegemony. And I think that both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump reject that entirely. And as somebody who's committed to a more traditional Reaganite conservatism, that's my principal objection to it. Again, everything JB was saying about the personality, I think that's very accurate. But I do think that this sort of declinist mentality from both camps is even more concerning to me.
Let me, and Avi, I do want you to get a chance to respond too, but I just want to throw this out there because, and I think I have enough bona fides on this show that people will not confuse me for a Trump supporter. But let me play the devil's advocate here. I have heard multiple people make the argument, yeah, Trump's provocation isn't good, but with foreign policy, maybe it's not a bad thing. I mean, it's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like, Trump, 2 years ago, invaded Iraq. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. It's not like Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was president. Hamas attacked Israel when Trump was, maybe not knowing, is this guy going to push the button, or we don't really know. Maybe that's a good thing. Like, could there be an argument for that, or is it just an unalloyed negative?
So I think both JB and Michael have good insights here. I'd like to add my own. I think a very big part of the problem, and it's something that America has contended, at least since the Cold War has ended, thank God, in a relatively peaceful manner, is the question of how to use power. And I don't mean an angry statement. I don't mean a joint declaration. I don't even mean a UN Security Council resolution. I mean the ability to use hard American power, such as aircraft carriers, armies, when and how. America remains quite fairly relatively confused, even during the war on terror. And you see it today with the Biden administration, and one expects perhaps the Harris administration. On the one hand, they supply Israel with weapons. They supply Ukraine with weapons. But on the other hand, they want to de-escalate also. And they want to, so it's kind of, you mentioned Nixon. This is very similar to how LBJ would micromanage the war in Vietnam. Whether or not you believe that war was winnable, it certainly was not winnable with pilots having to basically wait for the president on the phone to tell them which targets they can hit. To take, for instance, even if you don't care about Israel, even if you don't care about Ukraine, one of the core principles of American hegemony or even American power has been sea power, all the way back to Jefferson and the Barbary pirates, with the idea that we protect the navigational routes, especially after the British Empire collapsed. America is the guarantor of free trade along the seas. And right now, a group of Iran-backed terrorists, the Houthis, are basically dominating the Red Sea. And I check, as part of my job, I check CENTCOM's press releases every so often, and they're like, we blew up a drone here, and we blew up a couple of missiles here. I'm like, that's something if you're like a middling power to say we succeed in doing this. That's not something a superpower says. A superpower says they tried to hit us with drones. We blew up, 50 targets in one night. It's this aversion to really showing what America can do so that people respect it. And they keep going back to, now people in Europe certainly respect the ideas of international law, the ideas of your reputation, but America's enemies do not. And they have consistently shown that they do not. They do not care. Houthis, Iran, China, they do not care if you get up and shame them and say you're on the wrong side of history. So you're not accomplishing anything with that, and yet you still don't know what to do with power. And the same when it comes to Israel and Ukraine. When it comes to Trump, I'm into much about Trump, and people know me. I've been part of the not a fan of Trump for a long time. There's, on the one hand, you mentioned, JB, the provocations. You're absolutely right. Provocations, basically, if anybody remember, I wasn't old enough, but there was that time when Reagan accidentally joked about bombing Russia, and all of a sudden the Soviet Union thought they were good. So Trump basically does that every day of the week, several times a day. It's enough to give people heart attacks. On the other side of it, and that's something I wish people would somewhat consider, was that his thinking out of the box, even if he had like 9 bad ideas and 1 good idea, did bear fruit. The Abraham Accords are a lasting success. He did manage to constantly push the issue of the fact that Europe was, at least until Putin's invasion of Ukraine, was very high on the rhetoric of NATO, was very high on the importance of the alliance, but they didn't put their money where their mouth is. Not just in terms of the 2% GDP spending, whether or not it really matters, but in terms of even providing Ukraine with the weapons it needs. So really, the question a conservative of any kind, I think, thinker needs to ask themselves is, how do we use power judiciously, prudentially, in such a way that people around the world, not just America's friends, but also America's, more importantly, America's enemies and rivals, respect. And maybe they don't like you, but they'll respect you. That if you put a carrier there, they're not going to laugh at you.
Are there individuals who come to mind, and I don't necessarily even mean people that you hope or expect to run for president someday, but are there national figures who are offering a compelling foreign policy that you think we would be better off listening to?
Michael?
Well, I think Tom Cotton is a good example of somebody who has been doing this. I think he's been consistently strong on all three of our major enemies right now: Iran, Russia, and China. And I think he has a way of talking about these conflicts that resonates with the Republican base, which I don't think a lot of other political figures have figured out. Another example who's somewhat different and has a somewhat different skill set as a communicator is Mike Gallagher. I think he did an incredible job with the China committee on Capitol Hill, specifically tying both parties' interests to a sort of anti-communist foreign policy agenda. And I think that he had a sort of clarity of vision about that is not very common in national politics right now. And so it seems to me that, at least from the Republican side of the aisle, what you want to do is combine some of the instincts of both of those figures, right? They support a similar policy agenda. They communicate to two different audiences. How can we figure out a way to communicate that agenda to both audiences at the same time? I think that's one of the big problems facing hawks in the Republican Party right now.
JB, what are your thoughts?
I don't have any national figure recommendations. As a citizen of the state of Arkansas, the idea of Tom Cotton scares the bejesus out of me.
I actually wanted to know what your thoughts were on Cotton after you said that.
I'm not a fan. I appreciate where you're coming from, but to me, Cotton kind of represents one of the overall problems we have, where it's all this talk, and we're able to put up a lot of what, well, I won't say that's what Trump does, because I do think he will back it up with action sometimes. But all this talk, it's almost a level of irresponsibility. And I had an uncle, this was back in the 90s. I can't remember which conflict it was. It may have been Persian Gulf. It may have been something else. I don't remember. I think it was the Balkans, actually. But he made a comment. He said, if we ought to not go into a fight unless we're going in to actually fight and win the fight. And I remember as a young guy, it's like that kind of struck me. It's like, that makes sense. With World War II, you go in, that's the classic war. That's the classic image of what everybody wants to recall with America's ascent to power. You go in and you're going to fight until it's won or lost. And that's the reality. And right now there's so much that we talk, so much that we fund. It's almost like we have proxy wars going on all over the place, from the Middle East. I don't know for sure if you could say the same for East Asia, but the Middle East into Europe with Ukraine and Russia. It's like we are writing a lot of checks, and other people are having to cash them, and that's with their lives, And maybe it would be good for us to pull back from that. And I'm not saying necessarily that we need to pull back, but if we're not willing to pay the prices that is actually required to achieve the ends, is it really right? Is it even moral to go and tell other people to do it on our behalf, right? On behalf of our interests. And so that's the thing that concerns me with so much going on in the world today, is we're not really fully vested. And at the same time, we're requiring other parties to fully vest themselves to the ultimate heights.
So I don't necessarily have a national figure in mind. Josh knows for me that I think that we're in a time of great confusion, and not just when it comes to national security, but with a lot of things. A lot of the world is changing. A lot of ideas are being scrambled, and we're not really going to know where we stand until the music stops at some point. I would mention at least one figure who I don't entirely agree with on everything, but I do think he asks some very important questions. Is a fellow named Elbridge Colby. He's written a number of articles. He's very prominent on Twitter. And he talks about, like you say, JB, is that America is not investing the kind of money to have the force needed to be able to be ready on all the fronts it needs to be prepared for. This isn't like I said, this isn't the Cold War, where defense budgets were very generous and you were always ready to really put your money where your mouth is. And the result is that a lot of things are on a shoestring. And there's a lot of concern. You mentioned East Asia. There is a concern there. There's constant warning about China possibly invading Taiwan and possibly invading other countries or threatening other countries. And those are, for a lot of Americans, and understandably so, right? It's on the other side of the globe. Why should I care? But that's one of the most populous regions in the world. And that's not only one of the most populous regions in the world, it's one of the most important trade partners in many ways. And if communist China takes that over, that's a very big hit to the United States and to the West in general, and a great amount of power to a sworn, maybe not enemy just yet, but a sworn rival. Mm-hmm. So I agree that part of it is not just a question of communicating, although I think communicating is very important because, as I said, the Cold War is over. As much as I love that America won World War II, I love that America won the Cold War, but my wife and many people of her generation and afterward were born after the Cold War was over, and that rhetoric is going to decreasingly appeal to them. You need people who can explain to average Americans of any party why America should have power and why America should use it, and you can't just keep harking back to let me take really extreme example. In the couple of elections after the Civil War, so the Republican Party basically, they did what was called wave the bloody shirt, fight as you shot. But there came a point where there were enough younger voters who had not been old enough to really remember the war, where they finally said, look, guys, it's not going to work anymore. If we're going to explain American power, we need to use a different rationale. So I think it's the same thing here.
And related to that, because there's all sorts of policies that we can hope we get it right before catastrophe comes, right? Tax policy, economic policy. Sometimes the best way to institute a really good policy is when you instituted a really bad one, and then you get to learn from that experience. I mean, the world is replete with examples of people going from socialism to a more free market system for that exact reason.
Yes.
Are we? I'm not enough of a nihilist to say, well, we're just waiting for the next, World War III to start before we can get this right. But how much of this is we're sort of stuck in a moment? Because quite frankly, we in the West, with the exception obviously of Israel and other places around the world, we're in relative harmony, safety. It's not like, and so it's easier to ask the question, well, why do we care if China invades Taiwan? I mean, it's not, maybe people aren't indifferent to that, but are we really going to risk American blood and treasure over these people we've never met before? Do we even know enough about what's going on? When Russia invaded Ukraine, I would have just kind of took it for granted. This was kind of an easy one. And yet there are all sorts of people like, well, they're both very corrupt nations. Who are we to judge, who the aggressor is here? That could all change after you have a September 11th, an October 7th, after you have a bombing of Pearl Harbor. These things become very real in a hurry. So, and again, I don't mean this to sound very dark, but are we in some sense waiting for something to go catastrophically wrong before people begin to listen to these good ideas? Or is there some hope that we can right the ship so that we can avoid those massive conflicts?
So in the first place, Winston Churchill always referred to World War II as the unnecessary war, right? He did not think that it was necessary to go to war to defeat Nazi Germany the way that it happened. It was in that sense kind of a war of choice, right? Ineffectual isolationist politicians didn't know how to handle the rising threat from fascism, and therefore war became inevitable at a certain point in time. I don't think we're at that point. I think that World War III is still the avoidable war. So I'm optimistic or hopeful about that. But in terms of what Avi is saying about the sort of Elbridge-Colby point of we're not spending enough to handle all three of these areas all at once, I think that's really valid, especially from perspective of, we're not producing enough ammunition, we're not producing enough tanks, we're not producing enough planes, let alone ships, right? Which I think the naval issues I think are the biggest facing the country right now. But I think that part of the problem I have with Colby's approach to these questions and other restrainers or offshore balancers or whatever term we want to use to describe them, is that they really discount the ideological component of a lot of these conflicts. Josh, to your point earlier about, oh, Russia and Ukraine, they're both just sort of corrupt countries on the other side of the world. Why do we care about them? Well, I do think that Vladimir Putin's regime is a regime that has a different account of what a good and just society looks like, in contradistinction to the American founding, right? I think China, the Chinese Communist Party, has an account of a good and just society that is not compatible with ours. Iran too, their radical Islamism, and so I think these three powers, different as they are nonetheless aligned in that they don't agree with the principles of the American founding, and they want to see the power of those principles rolled back on a global stage. I'm not convinced, in fact, that the Cold War has ended. I think that it's entered a new and different stage, and that's why I think these people are so dangerous. And in a lot of ways, I think the mistake of the 1990s and even the early 2000s is that our political leaders said, well, the Soviet Union is gone. We won World War II. We won the Cold War. We don't have to invest in these things. Well, I disagree with that very fundamentally. I think that there are still lots of revolutionaries and barbarians on the world stage that we have to stand against. And in a lot of ways, I think to address those material problems that Colby brings up, I think we have to find a renewed confidence in the American founding and the idea that this is a sort of universally valid regime. What exactly that I'm not urging some sort of global revolutionary force going and toppling regimes all over the world, right? That's not at all what I'm saying. But just in terms of what is the nature of the struggle before us, I think that we have to see it in ideological terms. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to motivate the people to prevent the unnecessary war of the future.
I agree with a large part of that, Michael. And I think if you're going to confront the barbarians and on an ideological basis, the important thing is that you can never betray your own ideology. We can't be found hypocritical in the stances that we take. And going back to Josh's earlier mention regarding a national figure out there, this guy's not a national figure anymore, but he kind of, I've always wondered why is it that I like this guy so much? He's someone you'll know of, Michael, but Ben Sass. I appreciated just the level of responsibility, the level of consideration that he gave to a lot of issues. And maybe even the fact that he stepped away from politics is a sign of his character in and of itself, that he stepped away when it started getting real crazy. But it's that sort of model that appeals to me as far as someone who will stand according to the character principles and demonstrate a level of responsibility to the sincerity, the authenticity of the ideology. Because I don't think you can confront stuff that's going on with Putin or stuff that's going on with China or wherever else if you're Donald Trump and you've got the same stuff going on in your backyard, or at least you don't care as much about it when it's going on in your backyard. And so that gives me, that's something that appeals to me. And I keep looking for that champion out there, and I'm not really finding it right now. And that does get frustrating.
You guys are provoking each other, Michael, and dropping Tom Cotton. JB, you probably didn't know this. Michael worked for Ben Sass.
No, that's I've researched all of you guys before we get on this.
Okay.
Where do these guys come from? I saw that and it's like, oh yeah, Ben Sass.
I agree that he's a very, very great man.
So I thought I might inject a little bit of optimism into this discussion. Because I often have debates and discussions because people say that right now isolationism is making a comeback and it's now like it's back in the 1930s. It's nowhere near that. When people need to understand the isolation of the 1930s was something that was really very, very extreme. Prior to that, Americans were often wary of intervention or being involved in things around the world, but they would go in if it was not that risky or if they thought it was really a just cause. In the 1930s, due to a combination of factors, disillusionment with World War I was a big one, which happened around the world, even in Germany. The Great Depression basically said, we don't want to be involved with anyone, anywhere, period. And these, the majorities in favor of this, by the way, were overwhelming and bipartisan. It did not matter what area of the country you were talking about. It did not matter what kind of people you were talking about. They said, we don't want involvement in Europe, period, anymore. Let them have their own mess. I have not seen much, if any, evidence that isolationism in that sense is really making a comeback. Even so, you have your Tucker Carlsons, you have your people who are trying to revive Ron Paulism or Patrick Buchananism, but it doesn't resonate in the same way that it really did in the 1930s when you cut across a real cross stream of Americans. People forget America First was not just Charles Lindbergh. Even a fellow named JFK briefly was involved with them, and he certainly changed his mind later on. And even when you check the polls, even though you'll see Republicans somewhat soft on giving aid to Ukraine and Democrats getting somewhat soft on giving aid to Israel, you don't see the kind of wholesale, let's recreate Fortress America of even 1913. You do have questions. You do have people debating about the scope. You do have people debating about when and how. And I think some of those questions are legitimate. I think that it's important that in a democracy that the people have feedback, or the people will hit you hard. So I don't think we're anywhere near that everybody needs to be woken up, God forbid, by a Pearl Harbor. I don't think it's anywhere near there, thank goodness. I do think, however, that people, like I said, even if I agree with you somewhat, Michael, that the Cold War is not entirely over, like I said, the young voters, and including people my age, we grew up not really remembering the Cold War, and you need people who can explain to them why it is important to project power, why it is important to spend on defense, why it is important to build more ships, and to explain to them what those things do. You need to be able to explain those ways in a coherent manner, and you simply cannot take it for granted off of the fumes of the bigger Cold War or the global war on terror. And you also need to be able to keep it, and this is absolutely very critical, and I don't know how to solve this, is that it needs to be bipartisan. It really needs to be robustly bipartisan, and I'll explain why. One of the great errors that Woodrow Wilson did, bring back a big figure, in World War I.
One of
the big mistakes he made was he did not bring a major Republican leader with him to Paris when they were negotiating the Versailles Treaty. And this, keep in mind, was after the Republicans had retaken both houses and, more importantly, the Senate. Wilson was so arrogant that he thought just the brilliance of his arguments would be enough. And what he ended up doing was not even listening to even theoretically reasonable concerns of Republican senators, and there have been Republican and Democratic presidents, both who have done this. And the result was that Versailles fell through. And FDR, for all his mistakes, understood that mistake. And one of the important things he did was he brought Republicans on board into his administration, and he listened and talked to internationalist Republicans in order to make sure. Why? Because in America, there's no such thing as a party that's ruling forever. America is not Europe. In Europe, you can have a party that's ruling for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. That's not how it works in America. And if you don't have both parties firmly on board, even if you have a couple of cranks, there's always cranks. Even if you have a few cranks here and there, if you don't have the massive voters and the massive representatives genuinely supporting something like a general approach to the world, you're in trouble. You're going to end up with a yo-yo or some real whiplash. With one time a Democrat goes this, and you go one way the other way, and the other way have a Republican goes this, and no one can count on that. Allies can't count on that. Friends can't count on that. Mm-hmm. Who's going to bank their security and very existence on a political state that is so schizophrenic? So in addition to thinking about how to do it in terms of conservative, you have to think about how I'm going to get people, not just young people, just in general, to agree that there is a need, whatever you vote, whoever you like, this is the baseline for foreign policy. That's a big challenge.
So to that end, because I think that's a very good point, Avi, and it has not gone unobserved by many people that we live in a particularly polarized era. Yeah. That being said, I remember growing up, that old phrase, right? Politics ends at the water's edge. That was what we're all Americans at the end of the day, and we can all agree on some of these broader international issues. And that was never completely true, but it was partially true. It seemed to be more true now. So I'm just curious, what are we staring at in the face here? Is the issue that we just live in this bizarrely polarized era where if you really dig down to it, the parties aren't that far apart. They just hate each other so much, and they're so convinced that the other guy's going to destroy the country that, well, if you're for Ukraine, I'm for Russia. And certainly you can find those outliers. You can find your J.D. Vances, your Tucker Carlsons. You can find your Bernie Sanders. You can find those in the various degrees of seriousness, but on the more fringe positions. But do you think, and I'm going to open this up to everyone, do you think what we actually have here is an ideological fundamental difference that we can't get through? Or is this just a matter of we live in a hyper polarized era, but we do actually come to realize, agree on many of our international stances?
I think if you look at Congress itself, even sort of post-Trump elected Republicans, I don't think that there's a vast ideological gap in terms of what the lawmakers are actually trying to do or accomplish. On Ukraine aid, for instance, for the most part, especially in the Senate, this is less true of the House, but especially in the Senate, most U.S. senators, Republican and Democrat, both support Ukraine in its fight for national independence. I think that Ukraine is an interesting example because there, Republicans and Democrats have worked together effectively, I think, for the most part, in the Congress. But at the level of presidential politics, I think that Democrats have pursued a strategy of what we might call negative polarization around the war, right? They want to portray the war in Ukraine as Mr. Biden's war. They want it to be, we, the Democrats, are standing for democracy. The Republicans are on the side of autocracy, both at home and abroad. And therefore, I think that a lot of the goodwill that could be developed on these issues is in Congress is actually being burned by the president. And I think that in some ways, part of the problem is there's not really a strong figurehead for a lot of this stuff who's speaking for Congress per se, right? I think Mike Johnson has turned out to be much better than I anticipated he would be. But he's not playing this role, right? I don't think that either Senator Schumer or Senator McConnell is playing this role in the Senate right now. And so I think that a lot of the problems you're pointing out have to do with how we've executivatized, made everything about presidential politics, right? And so I actually think you're raising what is in some sense a constitutional question. And I think that the answer to your problem in some ways is a reassertion of congressional authority in foreign policy. So that's I think the broad answer. Specifically, how does that work out? I'm not entirely sure what Congress can do to do this. Especially since the president has so much power, rightly so, over foreign policy questions. But it does seem to me a problem related to the strength of the presidency and the weakness of Congress, at least with regard to foreign affairs.
JB, what do you think?
I probably trend around what Michael's saying there. To me, it's more of a cultural thing where there is just a lack of leadership. The leaders we have are not necessarily trusted. And then if they are trusted, once you dig into it a little bit, you realize, they don't need to be trusted. Just thinking back on the past few weeks with the different conventions, the Democratic convention and the Republican convention. I have, let me back up from there, actually. Talking about like Ukraine and Russia, I have friends who are probably leaning towards the libertarian route. And honestly, lately, I find myself leaning more towards that route during the Trump years. But when they look at Ukraine, they say, hey, it's not our war. It's not our business. Let them figure it out. And at the end of the day, when they're saying that, it's like, you know what? It's hard to argue with that. And unless there is a different reason why we would be fighting against it, and it is to stop an aggressor like Putin. But you bring that up, and it's like, well, we're allies with aggressors. We're allies with bad guys all over the world. And why is it Putin that we're going to pick? And so there's just a lack of substance within the ideology itself, as y'all have mentioned on that front. But when I look at the different leadership that we have out there, even, when Obama gave his speech, I actually thought Obama and Michelle Obama, for that matter, at the Democratic National Convention, I thought their speeches were better than Kamala Harris's speech as far as what they presented. I guess it's easier to do when you don't have as much to lose when you're at a convention. But when they presented it, specifically when former President Obama gave his pitch, gave his speech, I'm listening to it, and it's like, man, I could follow this guy. I could listen to this guy. I don't agree with everything this guy says, but at least he's got something he believes in. It's a place where he's definitively wanting to go. And I compared that to the Republican National Convention. And when President Trump got up there, and it was just lost. It was all over the place. One of the longest speeches in convention history. And it's like, there's just nothing here that I can hold on to, that I can believe in. And then I go back to the Democratic National Convention. We finished the speech. And as I look at his policies, it's like, oh, yeah, that's why I can't follow him, because there's some stuff I just cannot get on board with this guy. But if you've got some serious conviction, if you've got a serious sense of, I believe this is right and I'm going to hold to this, I'm willing to go along with you for a while. Just if I know the course is going to be steady towards that end. There's a poem. Yeah, it's William Butler Yeats. I've got it hanging on my wall, but it talks about the best lack all conviction. And it's like, you know what? That's where it feels like we're living right now. We're the best of us out there. They don't have that conviction needed for us to follow them, for us to be trustworthy, for them to be trustworthy, and us give them our allegiance or our loyalty and devotion as we move into these troubled waters that are out there. And then those who seem like they do have this stuff, have the right stuff, I just don't see them stepping up lately. And I don't really understand why that is. And so that's why I go back. I think it's an issue of our culture. Something's going on here that I don't like. And, I've got my first grandbaby. I had lunch with her today here at our house, have my first granddaughter. And I'm thinking, man, I want a world where she has a safer place to sit on a Sunday afternoon. Not that it's dangerous right now in America, but I don't see how we keep it from getting dangerous in the years ahead if we don't start taking some proactive and focus steps in this next term of the presidency.
So to your point regarding the best standing up, look, one of the things I like to place an emphasis on, and that probably annoys pretty much everybody, is that I believe that people who are ideological do not respect politics enough. Why? Because at the end of the day, you can be the most principled person in the world. You can have the most brilliant arguments in the world. If you fail to bring the people on your side, if you fail to bring the people of Congress on your side, then you're not going to go anywhere. And another thing is that, well, at the end of the day, the people pick the candidates on both sides. And if the people want to pick people who are absolutely not principled, who are absolutely not worth a darn, then that's who it's going to be. In a democracy, it begins and ends with the voters. There's really no way around that. So if we want better candidates, you can't just conjure them up. You have to do the hard work of convincing them. To give a good example, one of the complaints I hear from a lot of pro-Trumpers is that people like John McCain and Mitt Romney were all about doing the virtues of leadership, showing the virtues, but not really being interested in translating those virtues into actually accomplishing anything. Meanwhile, Trump appeared to them, I'm not saying he did or not, appeared to them to be the opposite. He doesn't care all about virtue, but he gets stuff done. Kind of like I say, like I like to tell people, he's very much a mid-century New York City war boss writ large. But if you want to convince people that you need the better sort, that you need the better type, then you need to explain how that's going to result in things, how life's better for them, right? Because your granddaughter is not going to have a better life on her front porch just from that person giving incredible, inspiring speeches. They also need to achieve real accomplishments. And to achieve real accomplishments in politics, like it or not, and this has always been true of politics, is you need to be willing to make ugly compromises, if you will. You need to be willing to shake the hands of people you can't stand. You need to be willing to sometimes make deals you're not proud of, or be willing to get yelled at, And in some cases, we live in the era of online. You need to be willing to have your family viciously attacked for no good reason. You need to be willing to put up with a lot. And
you're painting such an appealing picture, Avi.
No, I'm just. I'm not trying to be a downer here, but I am trying to say that it's not a Hollywood movie. You need to be willing to be a fighter to some extent. You don't need to, completely lose all your principles. I'm not saying that at all. But you do need to be willing to recognize that to get good things done in politics, you need to be able to bend the rules sometimes, or work around things sometimes, or play dirty tricks sometimes. How far you're willing to go, that's up to you. It's up to your decision. But historically speaking, the best leaders in American history, or almost all of them, had to do that to one extent or another. And I think that it's important to learn to talk about, when we talk about leadership, not just the ideal leadership, but effective principled leadership. And effective principled leadership means dealing with politics. That is true. And it has to be true in foreign policy anyways, because when you're dealing with enemies, when you're dealing with people who are unscrupulous, who don't follow any of the rules, then appealing to the rules is just not going to go anywhere. You need someone who at the very least can speak their language in some way. You mentioned Nixon. You could have FDR or Truman as a model if you want, but you need models of people who know how to show leadership on the world stage, not just in the Hollywood sense, but in the sense that people will listen and do. And again, that does not mean giving up on your principles. It does not mean giving up on leadership, but it does mean recognizing the constraints of what it means to work in the some thinkers call it the anarchic world of international politics, I would say.
I'm always in favor of injecting a little bit of realism into the conversation, but I also worry a bit when people talk about politics as a dirty business, because I think that fundamentally it's not. And I think a contrast between two Republican presidents of the last century is instructive. Nixon on the one hand and Ronald Reagan on the other. I think Nixon is a perfect example of the politics is dirty and I have to do bad things in order to get good things done. Both in terms of, obviously there's the Watergate scandal and his particular brand of domestic politics, but also in terms of his foreign policy of détente with the Soviet Union, right? He said, the worst thing is nuclear war. That's the thing that we absolutely have to avoid under all circumstances. And therefore, I'm going to cool down the Cold War even further. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to go to China. I'm going to make sure that we sort of stabilize things in this post-Vietnam era that he was trying to inaugurate. Reagan was different in that I don't think he viewed politics as a fundamentally dirty thing. I don't think he ever thought he had to compromise his principles. That's not to say that he doesn't view politics or foreign policy as negotiation, right? Of course he did that, right? Both domestically, there were certainly things that he negotiated, and in terms of his relationship with the Soviet Union, yes, absolutely, he negotiated things, and sometimes he did have to accept imperfect circumstances as opposed to some utopic idea of a good world, right? But at the end of the day, I think that he approached politics from a far, far more principled perspective, and that's actually what made him a more effective statesman. Right. I don't think that Richard Nixon's policies ever would have led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right. We can debate whether or not Reagan was the reason or a reason why the Soviet Union collapsed. But regardless, I do think he contributed to that collapse in a way that Nixon never could have. And so I think insofar as you're calling for realism, Avi, I'm very much on board, both in terms of our domestic politics and how we should approach the domestic sphere, but also in foreign policy. I think realism is important. At the same time, though, it must be principled, right? And I think those principles are actually a weapon in the fight to advance these things. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm so concerned. So many young Republicans seem to be turning to Richard Nixon as an example, as opposed to Ronald Reagan these days. And I think that maybe people will call me a zombie for this, but I'm not sure that Reaganism is dead or should be dead. I think that it's in fact the answer to a lot of the problems that we've been discussing on this call so far.
When Avi was talking, Reagan was the one that came to my mind. It's like, okay, that's a good example of what you're describing right there. My thoughts are when you mentioned that, Michael and Avi and Josh, do you think a guy like Reagan in this day and age could be effective? I mean, we think throw him into the middle of this polarized reality that we have right now just within the U.S. But then also Reagan was before 24-hour news, or at least before serious 24-hour news. He was before all of the information technologies that are out there, the social media. Is that even possible? Because looking back historically on Reagan, there's a lot that I find wrong with him. I mean, Josh calls himself a Burkean conservative. I would say I'm a Reagan conservative. You know, that's my roots right there. But I don't know if it would even be possible for such a guy to exist today. Or am I wrong?
I have mixed opinions on that, because I think when you're in Earth 2.0, it's hard to know, well, what would this alternative future look like? Because the thing that Reagan is often lauded for in conservative circles, and this is a position I agree with, is that he's an individual who had a very conservative core who understood how to adapt it to that moment. So could Reagan be successful today? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe he would recognize the difference between the 1980s and today, and he would adapt the conservative principles accordingly. That being said, Milton Friedman said of Ronald Reagan that he was the only president in his lifetime that did not learn ultimately how to say what the American people wanted to hear, but that the American people eventually wanted to hear what he had been saying for decades. And this is the same Reagan who had given the speech for Barry Goldwater in the 1960s when Goldwater lost in a landslide. So the same Reagan that ran against Gerald Ford and lost in the Republican convention. That was the same Ronald Reagan. And it took up until the 1980s before the nation finally said, wait a minute, maybe this guy makes sense. So I think there's a sort of lesson there in that an individual who wants to bring their principles forward needs to find a way to meet the people. But sometimes the people need to find a way to meet the principles. And sometimes when those two things come together, you end up with your Lincoln or your Reagan or your Winston Churchills.
So I would comment, first of all, on Michael. I absolutely agree with you on realism. I would not really call my view realism, more like realistic. In other words, even if you're entirely ideological, you need to understand the world as it is and then try and advance your principles. With regard to I definitely agree that Reagan was definitely a great role model there. But here's where my problem is. When people talk about zombie Reaganism, at least the serious ones, they're talking about something which I complain about a lot, which is a very gross caricature I blame on Republican consultants, according to which, or maybe media people or what have you, who basically turned him into a guy who cut taxes and won the Cold War. And they talk they talk about his great speeches, and they were great, but they talk very little about how he carefully governed, how he carefully triangulated the people towards him, how he didn't. You talk about the speech with Goldwater. What he was doing was he was saying something that nobody in 1964 was willing to listen to. So a lot of people who were Republican, they were loyal Republicans, they voted for Goldwater, but most of the country thought he was nuts in one case or another. Not psychologically, it's another story. But Reagan, I think, I wouldn't say he would be guaranteed to succeed today, but let's imagine a Ronald Reagan who's about 60 years of age today, right? 70 years of age today. He would have been, like he was in life, a master of media, a man who was always interested in new kinds of media. He had much experience, not just as a movie star, but also as a radio host, which helped him a lot with his speeches. He famously would send out records to, when he started out his political career, to all sorts of people where they could listen to. Nowadays, he'd probably have a YouTube channel. So I actually don't doubt that he would still be a very effective communicator in this day and age. Now, whether or not he would be effective enough to overcome Donald Trump was his own, like it or not, ability to communicate with people, I don't know. But I do agree that Reagan is definitely a good standpoint. I do think we should have more than one source of inspiration in that sense. And the Republican Party certainly has plenty of great leaders that have managed to steer the people towards where they wanted to go. But I think it goes back to something that really troubles me, and that's that a lot of people who talk about the right don't really know their own history. They don't. They know the speeches. They don't know the people. And because they don't know the people, they're incredibly impatient because they don't match the speeches, or they don't perfectly match the speeches. People talk about Lincoln, the brilliant orator, and he was a brilliant orator, but they don't talk about the triangulator who managed to, once again, get America to where he wanted to go. Or, like you said, Reagan. Lots of people know the speeches. Lots of people know they cut taxes. They don't know how much he had to haggle and bargain and negotiate with the Soviet leaders and with Gorbachev, and how he had to do things like that. And I think that if we explained that it wasn't so Hollywoody, that it wasn't just a guy gives a good speech, or eventually when we have a female president, a woman gives a good speech, and that's it, everything is resolved. If we explained that it's a little harder than that it moves a little slower than that if you sometimes run into snags and it's not the end of the world, then I think if we could do that, then people, I think, would become a little less impatient. Because notice how a big part of polarization today is incredible impatience. We want to win now. We want to get everything now. We want all the laws we want now, even though, there's all sorts of problems getting bipartisan stuff through Congress. And I think that an effective Reagan today would be someone who would be willing to explain, I am a full-on conservative, but you guys need to understand that you need to move step by step by step sometimes. Sometimes you can have a revolution, but sometimes you need to move step by step. But I am definitely in agreement about Reagan being a standard bearer, but with the one caveat of the actual Ronald Reagan, not the caricature drawn by either the left or the right. The inspiring but complicated, the illuminating but pragmatic politician and leader. That's the person you need to be selling, not a Hollywood concept. Even though I'm sure he's big on Hollywood.
If I could make a point about media real quick, I think that one of the things that made Reagan a great communicator was his ability to use mass media to get out his message. And I think we're in an era where mass media is changing, right? I think that we have a tendency to assume that the internet is all mass media, right? And that this is something that anybody can access, and that is therefore something that everybody sees. But I think mass media in the 1980s and mass media today look very different, right? So mass media in the 80s was the three big channels, and then we were starting to have cable, and you had radio, but not the kind of conservative talk radio that we have, right? So that was sort of like the media environment in the 1980s, and I think we have a tendency to think, especially people who are interested in politics, have a tendency to think of mass media today as social media. But I'm not convinced that social media is mass media, right? It seems to me that in a lot of ways, social media silos people. And so mass media in the 20th century, its effect was to bring everybody together around the same sources of information, the same outlets, the same networks. Whereas the internet today has a tendency to fracture people and to silo people. And so I'm not sure that, and Avi, you weren't saying this at all, but I'm not sure that being good at Twitter, say, is the same thing as Ronald Reagan being an effective communicator during televised press conferences, right? So I actually think that social media can serve as a distraction for a lot of political leaders today. And so thinking through what mass media means, I think that's a really important thing, and not just assuming that social media is the same thing as mass media. especially in a democracy like ours.
We are up against the clock, and this is such a big topic that I don't think there is any appropriate way to land this ship. So I'm just going to thank each of you for your insights. I definitely appreciated the conversation. JB, Avi, Michael, thank you guys so much for taking the time. I'm going to have all of you on again at some point. Avi, if we can find a time that works for you. Thank you guys. I appreciate it. Thank you for those of you out there watching, and for those of you watching the archive video after I get it posted later. I hope we will see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah.